Trish, I'm going to start off by playing a 1-minute video that's going to describe what I'm going to describe over the next hour. That's, if I can find my cursor, here it is. It's your WMS 5 inspiration for the day. All right, so thank you again, Trish, for that introduction. And thank you all for coming to this discussion about the new Wechsler Memory Scale 5th edition. Again, I'm Jennifer Puig, and I've been a research director on the WMS 5 project off and on for its 8 years in development. My learning objectives for you all today. I am going to give a very high-level overview of what the WMS 5 looks like. And then I'm going to take a bit of a deeper dive into the subtests, what's the same and what's changed. Then I'm going to talk about scores because we have a lot of them. And finally, I'm going to give you the highlights of some of the reliability and validity data so you have a sense of the usefulness of the scores and the measure for your clinical practice. And again, as Trish said, if we have time, I will take some questions. So let's begin. All about the WMS 5. So the Wechsler Memory Scale, 5th edition, is an individually administered comprehensive clinical instrument for assessing the memory and visual working memory of individuals ages 16 years old through 90 years old. The WMS is among the most frequently used measures of memory by assessment psychologists and neuropsychologists. It has 7 subtests that measure 5 broad domains. The WMS 5 has 2 administration options. There's a digital administration option through the Q Interactive platform and a paper pencil administration. We have several scoring options for the 2 administration options. If you administer the assessment through Q Interactive, scoring and reporting is completed digitally. There are some subtests that you need to score yourself, but there are other subtests that are scored automatically. And then at the end of the assessment, a report is compiled. If you administer the paper version of WMS 5, you have the option to hand score or to use the Q Global Scoring Assistant. That's our online scoring assistant. And all of the lookup tables are available in the manuals to facilitate hand scoring. A little bit more about Q Interactive. I'm going to discuss some subtests that I haven't introduced yet, so bear with me with that. I will describe them in detail later on. So if you administer the WMS 5 on Q Interactive, all of the administration and scoring instructions are provided through an app on an iPad. The examinee responds to most subtests on a separate iPad. For subtests with drawing requirements, the examinee responds in a paper response booklet, and the system automatically selects the correct battery and item sets based on the examinee's age. 2 subtests that were not fully digital for the WMS 4 are now fully digital. They are the designs and spatial addition subtests. For those of you who are familiar with these subtests, you no longer need grids, cards, or chips to administer them on Q Interactive. For those of you who are not familiar with them, we'll discuss them in a little bit. So scoring is also available through Q Global, Pearson's online scoring assistant. This is for examiners who administer the WMS 5 in paper. Raw score data is entered into Q Global, which then derives scores and generates a report. There's also available through Q Global our digital materials, including both manuals and all 3 stimulus books. These digital assets facilitate remote testing when that testing situation is required. Next, I'm going to talk a little bit about the 5 revision goals for the WMS 5. First, we wanted to update the norms while also maintaining co-norming with the WACE 5. The second one was we wanted to shorten administration time through reducing subtest administration times and developing flexible administration options. Due to the high overlap between memory and learning, we wanted to develop scores that reflect single trial and multi-trial learning. We also wanted to update and modernize content, as some of the WMS 5 content has been with us for a very long time. Finally, we wanted to increase construct coverage through the expansion of process scores. Talk a little bit more in depth about some of the main updates for the WMS 5. So this slide touches on the major updates. So the new normative data was collected along with WACE 5 and was stratified according to the 2022 US Census. We've expanded the scores available on WMS 5. So for those of you who are familiar with the advanced clinical solutions for WACE and WMS, we've incorporated the additional WMS scores that were available in the ACS into the main test. We've developed new scores to reflect learning, and we've added more discrepancy analyses to the ability memory analysis. We've also developed new forms for the WMS 5. The standard form includes all of the WMS 5 subtests, and that's very similar to the WMS 4, in that the WMS 4 has all the subtests. The short form is a sample of subtests from the 3 major domains that are assessed by WMS. The alternate form is a parallel form that assesses auditory and visual memory, and the immediate memory screener is embedded in the standard form. So let's delve a little deeper into the WMS 5 subtests. I'm going to talk about the major changes to the subtests and discuss the different forms on which they are included. You're also going to see on the right-hand side of your screen just the different scores that are available for that subtest. We're going to talk about scores in depth in a little bit, but this is just to provide you with an overall summary of the scores available. Okay. So the first subtest in the WMS 5 standard form is the brief cognitive status exam. It is only available on the standard form or as a standalone test. This subtest is a screener for potential cognitive impairments. This subtest is optional and does not contribute to the WMS 5 index scores. No changes have been made to the content of this subtest. It still samples from the following domains: orientation, time estimation, mental control, visual spatial planning and reasoning, incidental recall, inhibition, and verbal production. Updates to the scoring method were made to reflect changes in the normative sample. The main score derived from this subtest is a base rate that controls for age and education level. This base rate has a qualitative descriptor for ease of communication. The BCSE will also be available as a standalone screener. In this form, it's going to be called the Brief Cognitive Status Exam Normative Update. As a standalone assessment, the BCSE NU is a level B assessment, whereas the WMS 5 is a level C assessment. And finally, this subtest takes about approximately 10 minutes to administer. Okay. The logical memory subtest is included on all forms of the WMS 5 and is a measure of auditory memory for narrative information. All versions of this subtest include an immediate recall, a delayed recall, and a delayed recognition condition. The content of the logical memory subtest was updated for the standard and short forms. So that means 3 new stories. But for those of you that like the content of WMS 4, the logical memory subtest for the alternate form was retained for the WMS, was retained from the WMS 4. The administration procedures across all forms remain the same. So 2 stories are read to the examinee. There are different stories for examinees ages 16 to 69 and 70 to 90 years old. The first story for examinees ages 70 to 90 years old is read twice. After a time delay, the delayed recall and recognition conditions are administered. The primary subtest scores capture performance on the immediate and delayed recall conditions. Process scores capture performance on individual stories or item sets and are reported as scaled scores or cumulative percentages. Contrast scaled scores are available to compare performance on aspects of the subtest. The visual reproduction subtest is also included on all three forms of the WMS-5. This subtest measures visual memory for designs. All versions of the subtest include an immediate recall, a delayed recall, and a delayed recognition condition. The designs were updated for the standard and short forms. The designs were retained from WMS-4 for the alternate form. The administration procedures were changed from the previous edition. There are now 2 learning trials across all items. The number of items was reduced from 5 to 4 to accommodate the additional time required for the extra learning trial. Although the designs from WMS-4 were retained for the alternate form, the administration procedures were updated to feature the extra learning trial. Visual reproduction on the alternate form of the WMS-5 also features 4 items instead of 5. So the same item set is administered to all examinees. And the primary subtest scores reflect performance on the immediate and delayed recall conditions. Process scores are reported as scaled scores and cumulative percentages and provide additional information about single trial and multi-trial learning, the amount of time the examinee takes to complete the drawings, errors in the examinee's drawings, performance on the recognition condition, as well as performance on the optional copy condition. Contrast scaled scores are available to compare performance on aspects of the subtest. The verbal paired associates subtest is only available on the standard form of the WMS-5. This subtest measures auditory cued recall for word pairs. As in the previous edition, there are separate word lists for examinees ages 16 to 69 and 70 to 90 years old. One word pair was updated, the other word pairs remain the same. The administration procedures are the same as the previous edition. However, the number of learning trials was reduced from 4 to 3. For those of you that use the California Verbal Learning Test 3rd edition, the verbal paired associates primary subtest scores can be substituted with CVLT3 linked scaled scores. So specifically, the CVLT3 trials 1 through 5 correct standard score can be converted to a scaled score that replaces the verbal paired associates 1 score and can be used to derive index scores. The CVLT3 delayed recall standard score can be converted to a scaled score that replaces the verbal paired associates 2 score and can be used to derive index scores. This is the only score substitution available for WMS-5. Please note that some analyses are not available when this substitution is made, and I'll talk a little bit about what those are later on in the presentation. The primary subtest scores reflect performance on the immediate and delayed recall conditions. The process scores are reported as scaled scores and cumulative percentages and describe single trial and multi-trial learning, recall of easily associated and difficult to associate words, intrusion errors and whether the intrusions are from the original list or not, free recall of the word list, and recognition memory, including recognition hits, false positives, and discriminability. Contrast scaled scores are available to compare performance on aspects of the subtest. The design subtest is only available on the standard form and is only administered to examinees 16 to 69 years old. This subtest measures visual content and spatial memory. The content of the design subtest was updated for the WMS-5. 2 new items were developed and 1 item was retained from the WMS-4. The overall number of items was reduced from 4 to 3. And also, instead of an increasing number of designs on the grid, the number of designs is held the same across all 3 items. The primary subtest scores reflect performance on the immediate and delayed recall conditions. Process scores describe memory for designs or content, spatial memory for card locations, and performance on the recognition condition. Contrast scaled scores are available to compare performance on aspects of the subtest. All right, next we have the visual working memory subtests. Symbol span and spatial addition are the 2 visual working memory subtests in the WMS-5 battery. They are both available on the standard form. Well, both of the subtests are available on the standard form, and symbol span is available on the short form. Neither of these subtests are available on the alternate form. These subtests and the index score that they contribute to are shared with the WAIS-5. If you're administering the WAIS-5 and WMS-5 in the same battery, administer these subtests only once. If you are using paper, these scores are easily transferable between batteries, so you can use them to calculate the index score and analyses in both batteries. If you're using the Q Interactive platform to administer the WAIS and WMS, deciding on which battery to administer these subtests in is a bit more complicated, as the scores do not automatically transfer between batteries. We will provide information to help examiners decide which battery to administer these subtests in on the FAQ that's on the WMS-5 website. Administration procedures for both subtests are the same from the WMS-4. However, there's been a change in materials for the spatial addition subtest. So for those of you who are familiar with the spatial addition subtest on the WAIS-5, it is the same for the WMS-5 as it is for the WAIS-5. So instead of cards in the memory grid, which were WMS-4, you're going to use plastic chips and the spatial addition grid, which is the 5th edition of both subtests. The 5th edition of the subtest, sorry. So scores. So subtest level scaled scores are available for both subtests. There are no process scores available for these subtests. And there are also no subtest level contrast scaled scores available, but there are index level contrast scaled scores for the visual working memory index. Okay. So those slides had a lot of information on them, and I wanted to highlight the different forms that are available for the WMS-5 and the subtests that are included on those forms. The standard form consists of all subtests and provides the most in-depth information about the examinee's short and long-term memory and visual working memory functioning. The short form is a brief battery of subtests that can be used to sample immediate and delayed recall for orally and visually presented information, as well as visual working memory. The alternate form consists of alternate versions of the auditory and visual subtests in the short form. The immediate memory screener is embedded within the standard form, and it allows the examiner to administer the immediate recall conditions to screen for memory weaknesses before deciding whether or not to continue with the standard form. This slide shows the administration times by form for the different WMS-5 batteries. This is the amount of time it took 50% of the normative sample to complete the subtests during the standardization stage. So the standard form takes about 70 minutes to complete, which is about 15 minutes shorter than WMS-4. This administration time includes the elapsed times required between the immediate and delayed recall conditions. The short form and alternate form take around 25 minutes to complete, give or take 2 minutes, and these administration times do not include the elapsed time required between the immediate and delayed recall conditions. The immediate memory screener for examinees ages 16 to 69 takes about 25 minutes, and for examinees ages 70 to 90, it takes about 17 minutes. The average subtest administration time ranges from 4 minutes for logical memory 1 to 9 minutes for spatial addition. Now let's talk a bit about what is and is not included in the WMS-5 standard kit. So on the left-hand side of your screen, you see a list of all the materials in the WMS-5 paper and pencil kit, and that includes both manuals, a package of 25 standard record forms and 25 response booklets, stimulus books 1 and 2 for administering the BCSE, memory and working memory subtests, the manipulatives needed for the design subtest, the manipulatives needed for the spatial addition subtest, and the scoring template for visual reproduction and the clock drawing task. But sold separately is the alternate record form and the alternate form stimulus book and the short record form. So the administration and scoring manual covers all forms of the WMS 5, but specific administration instructions for the alternate form are in the record form and the alternate form stimulus book. And the short record form is an abbreviated version of the standard record form. Okay. Now that we've talked about the subtests in the WMS 5 battery, let's discuss the scores that are derived from them. So this slide shows the framework for the primary index scores on the WMS 5 for the WMS 5 across 5 domains. The auditory memory index is composed of the logical memory 1 and 2 and verbal paired associates 1 and 2 subtest scores. The visual memory index has different compositions based on the examinee's age. For examinees ages 16 to 69 years old, the index is composed of the visual reproduction 1 and 2 and designs 1 and 2 scores. For examinees ages 70 to 90 years old, the index is composed of the visual reproduction 1 and 2 scores. The visual working memory index is composed of symbol span and spatial addition. The immediate memory and delayed memory indexes have different compositions based on the examinee's age. For examinees ages 16 to 69 years old, these indexes are composed of the immediate or delayed recall condition scores, respectively. For examinees ages 70 to 90 years old, these indexes are composed of the immediate or delayed recall condition scores for logical memory, visual reproduction, and verbal paired associates. The ancillary index scores provide examiners with further information about the nature of an examinee's performance on the test by breaking the primary index scores into their component cognitive skills or combining process scores. The auditory and visual memory domains are broken down into separate immediate memory and delayed memory index scores. There are also index scores for the recognition conditions. Please note that the visual memory ancillary index scores are not available for examinees ages 70 to 90 years old because scores from the design subtest are required for them. The design's content and design spatial index scores are also not available for examinees ages 70 to 90 years old. So the process scores for the design subtests are combined across the immediate and delayed recall conditions to derive the design's content and design spatial indexes. Finally, there are new indexes that reflect single trial and multi-trial learning. The multi-trial learning index is composed of all the process scores that reflect the examinee's performance on the last trial of an item for subtests that have multiple trials. The single trial learning index is composed of process and/or subtest scores that reflect the examinee's performance on the first trial of an item. Please note that the composition of scores that contribute to these indexes differs based on the examinee's age. Process scores. So instead of listing out all the process scores, I put together a slide that tells you how much of each process score is available for each subtest. For logical memory and visual reproduction, all process scores are available on the standard and short forms. The verbal paired associates and designs process scores are only available on the standard form. The alternate form has a limited number of process scores available for the logical memory and visual reproduction subtest. For the logical memory subtest, scaled scores are available for each of the individual story recalls across the immediate and delayed recall conditions. This includes separate scaled scores for the first and second recall of story A for examinees 70 to 90 years old. Cumulative percentages are available for each of the recognition item sets for the individual stories, and this allows examiners to see performance on individual stories across all of the conditions. For the visual reproduction subtest, there are scaled scores for the average item completion time for the immediate and delayed recall conditions. There are separate scaled scores reflecting performance on trial 1 and trial 2 of the immediate recall items. And there are cumulative percentages for additional design elements that the examinee may have drawn. This is in effect the error score for this subtest. A cumulative percentage describing performance on the recognition condition is available, as well as the optional copy condition. And I should say, I'm talking about cumulative percentages, but the slide says base rates. I'm talking about the same thing. So when I say cumulative percentages, I also mean base rates. Verbal paired associates. If there's one thing I've learned through working at Pearson, it's that there can't be too many scores on a list learning task. And verbal paired associates certainly delivers scores. So we have a lot of really great process scores that really break down the examinee's performance on this subtest. So we have the first and last trials of the immediate recall conditions. We also have scaled scores that reflect easy and hard items. So what do I mean by that? So there are some word pairs that are easily associated, like cat and dog. And there are some word pairs that do not have a clear relationship with each other, like tiger and coffee. As you can imagine, the easy to associate word pairs are easier to remember than the difficult to associate word pairs. And there are separate scaled scores describing the examinee's performance on the easy to associate word pairs and the difficult to associate word pairs. There's also a scaled score available for the optional word recall condition that reflects the examinee's free recall of all the words in the word pair list without having to associate them. Cumulative percentages are available for extra list and intra-list intrusions for the immediate and delayed recall conditions. Extra list intrusions are any response that an examinee gives that was not on the original word pair list. And an intra-list intrusion is any incorrect word pairing. That is, the examinee says a word that was on the target list, but associates it incorrectly. For delayed recall, cumulative percentages are also available for overall intrusions and easy and hard items. There are also cumulative percentages for process scores for the recognition condition, and these include easy and hard items, recognition hits, or the number of correctly identified word pairs, false positives, or the number of incorrectly identified word pairs. That is, word pairs that the examinee said were on the original list but were not, and discriminability. So this is a different way to evaluate performance on the recognition task that equally weighs identifying correct and incorrect word pairs. There's also separate cumulative percentages that reflect intrusion and repetition errors on the optional word recall condition. Finally, the design subtest has 4 process scaled scores available that reflect performance on the correct placement of the cards on the grid and the correct card identification for both the immediate and delayed recall conditions. You'll also see at the bottom of the slide that I have contrast scaled scores for each of the subtests. That's just the number of contrast scaled scores that are available for each of those subtests. I'll talk about that a little bit more when we talk about for my slide for contrast scaled scores. All right, discrepancy analyses. In addition to process scores, there are many scores available that allow the examiner to compare the examinee's performance across and within subtests, as well as across WMS 5 and WACE 5. And I'm going to talk about the different methods for comparing scores and then discuss the ability memory analyses. So the scores that are on this slide are only available on the standard form, and those are the subtest level within indexes. What's the purpose of those? These analyses allow the examiner to determine whether there is significant variability in the scores that contribute to the primary index scores. These analyses are only available for indexes that have 3 or more scores that contribute to them. So I should say that detection of significant variability in the scores that contribute to an index does not invalidate the index, but it should be considered when interpreting the scores and may help the examiner identify areas that require further investigation. When the CVLT3 scores are substituted for the verbal paired associates score, the auditory, immediate, and delayed memory subtest level within index score analyses are not available. For the primary indexes that are derived from 2 subtest scaled scores, there are subtest level discrepancy comparisons available. So that's the visual working memory index subtests and the visual memory index subtests for examinees ages 70 to 90 years old. So finally, in an appendix in the administration and scoring manual, there are critical values at the p less than 0.01 and 0.05 levels for all the different subtest subtest condition combinations. And that's just for pairwise comparisons for examiners that need those analyses. Contrast scores. Contrast scaled scores are a different way to compare subtests, conditions, and index scores. Without getting too far into the weeds, traditional discrepancy analyses have some limitations in that there's a general assumption that a discrepancy between scores is constant for people of different abilities. This assumption is generally incorrect. It's not always incorrect. A contrast scaled score reflects the examinee's performance on a subtest, condition, or an index, controlling for their performance on a different subtest, condition, or an index. So that sort of eliminates the requirement for that assumption. So for example, let's just give an example of what this looks like in practice. If an examinee obtains a scaled score of 10 on the delayed recall condition of logical memory, they are performing in the average range compared to their same age peers. However, this is not often not the information an examiner needs to determine a person's memory functioning because it does not describe how much the person remembered or forgot. It's more informative to know how much information the examinee remembered after a time delay, taking into consideration how much information they remembered immediately after the information was presented. Contrast scores provide this information. So if the same examinee who obtained a scaled score of 10 on logical memory delayed recall obtains a scaled score of 15 on logical memory immediate recall, their contrast score would be a 5. And this indicates that their performance on the delayed recall condition is below average compared to other people who achieved an above average score on the immediate recall condition. Conversely, if an examinee who obtained a scaled score of 10 on logical memory delayed obtains a scaled score of 7 on logical memory immediate recall, their contrast score would be a 15. This indicates that their performance on the delayed recall condition is above average compared to other people who achieved a low average score on the immediate recall condition. As you can imagine, you may have different interpretations of the examinee's performance based on the contrast score, scaled score results. Although there are some exceptions, the contrast scaled scores across the subtests, conditions, and indexes describe comparisons between immediate versus delayed recall, recognition versus delayed recall, auditory versus visual memory, and single trial versus multi-trial learning. Okay. Comparisons between selected WAIS-5 composite scores and WMS-5 index scores are available with the WMS-5. These analyses are possible because of the co-collection and co-norming of the WAIS and WMS samples. The WAIS-5 composite scores that are available for these comparisons include the General Ability Index, the Verbal Comprehension Index, and the Visual Spatial Index. There are 3 types of comparison scores. The simple difference method, in which the WMS-5 index score is subtracted from the WAIS-5 composite score. This is available for the WMS-5 primary indexes and all the ancillary index scores except for the single trial and multi-trial learning indexes. The predicted difference method, in which one of the WAIS-5 composite scores is used to predict a WMS-5 primary index score, and then the predicted WMS-5 index score is subtracted from the actual WMS-5 index score. This is only available for the 5 WMS-5 primary index scores. And then finally, contrast scaled scores. 10 contrast scaled scores are available for selected comparisons of the WAIS-5 composites and the WMS-5 indexes. The standard form features all the ability memory analyses on this slide. For the short and alternate forms, only the simple difference method is available for the index scores that are available on those forms. All right. Now we can talk about data. So in this next section, I'm going to review the normative sample and just give you some of the highlights of the reliability and validity results for the WMS-5. Let's talk a bit about the normative sample. This sample was collected between March 2023 and October 2024. Personal protective equipment was not used during data collection. The age range for the normative sample is 16 to 90 years old. The sample is comprised of 1,297 people. This is approximately 100 people for each of the 13 age bands. Unfortunately, we had to drop a couple of cases after data collection was completed due to significant amounts of unusual data, and that's why it's not 1,300. The sample was stratified by sex, education level, ethnicity, and geographic region according to the 2022 US Census. The sample was also stratified by WAIS-5 ability as measured by the General Ability Index. So within each of the 13 age bands, the mean GAI score is 100 and the standard deviation is 15. Here is a snapshot of the reliabilities for the primary subtest and index scores for the WMS-5 by age group. At the subtest level, average reliabilities ranged from good to excellent for examinees ages 16 to 69 years old. The average reliabilities ranged from acceptable to excellent for examinees 70 to 90 years old. The 0.74 reliability for this age group was for verbal paired associates 2, which has a greatly restricted range of raw score points that results in a lower reliability for this subtest, but all of the other subtests had reliabilities in the good to excellent range, so 0.80 and higher. At the index level, the reliabilities for both age groups were excellent. So for ages 16 to 69, the range was 0.92 to 0.96. And for ages 70 to 90 years old, the range was 0.93 to 0.98. Let's talk a little bit about construct and concurrent validity. So construct validity was assessed through intercorrelation studies and factor analysis. So there are strong intercorrelations between subtest and index scores according to the expected patterns of convergence and divergence. Specifically, conditions within subtests correlated more highly than conditions across subtests, and auditory subtests correlated more highly than visual subtests, and vice versa, as a general rule. Confirmatory factor analysis supported a 3-factor model over a 2-factor model, and those factors included auditory memory, visual memory, and visual working memory. Concurrent validity studies examine the relations between WMS-5 and other tests. The WMS-5 was examined with other measures of memory, including the WMS-4, the CVLT-3, and the wide range assessment of memory and learning 3, which is also called the RAML. So correlations between the WMS-4 primary subtest and index scores and the WMS-5 primary subtest and index scores were high. In the WMS-5 and CVLT-3 study, the highest correlations were between the CVLT-3 scores and the auditory memory subtests and indexes. The lowest correlations were between the WMS-5 scores and the scores on the CVLT-3 measuring errors and attention. In the WMS-5 RAML-3 study, the highest correlations were between the auditory and verbal memory subtests and indexes, respectively. And the lowest correlations were between the visual working memory and working memory subtests. This was expected because the RAML-3 working memory index the RAML-3 has measures of auditory and visual working memory, whereas the WMS just has visual working memory. So we were anticipating lower correlations between those two index and subtests. The WMS-5 was examined with measures of intelligence, including WAIS-5 and KBIT-2 revised. In the WMS-5 and WAIS-5 study, the highest correlations were observed between the auditory memory indexes and the overall cognitive functioning indexes. So, for example, the full scale IQ. The lowest correlations were between the WMS-5 subtest and index scores and the WAIS-5 subtest and index processing speed scores. In the WMS-5, excuse me, and KBIT-2 revised study, the highest correlations were observed between the auditory memory subtests and index scores and the verbal subtests and overall index scores. The lowest correlations were noted between the design spatial index and the KBIT-2 revised subtest and index scores. The WMS-5 and the DCAFS advanced standardization data were collected at the same time. So we ran a validity study on examinees who participated in both studies. In general, the highest correlations were observed between the WMS-5 visual working memory subtest and index scores and the DCAFS advanced test scores. Okay. Okay. So now let's talk about the clinical and non-clinical group studies. So the WMS is used across a wide variety of patient populations, and in order to establish preliminary clinical validity, we sought to collect data from individuals with diagnoses that focus on memory impairment or where memory is a common concern. So the WMS-5 is often a critical part of a battery of tests that's used to assess a person being considered for particular diagnoses or status. So for example, it's used to assess for neurocognitive conditions like intellectual disability, dementia, mild cognitive impairment, or specific learning disorder. The WMS can also be used in other types of evaluations to understand strengths and treatment needs, such as evaluations for ADHD, autism spectrum disorder, and traumatic brain injury. And then finally, we have an increasing number of people who are reaching older ages, and it's often the case that we get questions about out-of-age range testing. In order to provide examiners with preliminary information about WMS performance outside the upper age range of the test, we conducted a study among individuals over 91 years old. So this is just an overview of all the clinical validity studies we have. But for the purposes of the remaining discussion, I'm going to discuss a subsection of these studies. Okay. So these next few slides highlight the findings and dig a little bit deeper into what's driving those findings for some of the clinical validity studies we have for WMS. So the charts on the next 3 pages show the effect sizes of the differences between the scores of individuals in the clinical group, in a clinical or non-clinical group, and matched controls from the normative sample. Effect sizes that are statistically significant at the p less than 0.05 level are denoted by 1 asterisk, and those significant at the p less than 0.01 level have 2 asterisks. Statistically significant findings are also highlighted in yellow. The different shades of yellow are not meaningful, but rather an error of formatting that I could not reverse. So don't pay attention to the shading, it's just the yellow. Okay. So first, I will talk about our older adult studies, the Alzheimer's group, the Alzheimer's group, the MCI group, and the ages 91 to 98 group. The Alzheimer's group demonstrated lower performance than the matched control group across all the primary index scores as expected. The MCI group demonstrated lower performance than matched controls on the visual memory, visual working memory, and delayed memory index scores, with no significant difference in the auditory and immediate memory indexes. This is consistent with research indicating that visual memory and delayed recall are often impaired among individuals with MCI, and particularly amnestic MCI. For the ages 91 to 98 group, the norms for the 85 to 90-year-old age band were applied, and then the matched control group was matched on all demographic variables except for age. So this group demonstrated lower performance than matched controls on the visual working memory index. Next, let's talk about the adolescent and young adult samples. The autism spectrum disorder group, they're a little bit older than young adult, but let's just call it the adult samples. So the autism spectrum disorder group and the specific learning disorder mathematics group. The autism spectrum disorder group demonstrated lower performance on the visual working memory index than matched controls. The SLD math group demonstrated lower performance on the visual, immediate, and delayed memory indexes than matched controls. So the findings that these groups demonstrated lower performance on tests of visual memory and working memory are consistent with research indicating that visual spatial processing is a relative weakness among individuals with these diagnoses. In particular, this weakness seems to affect memory performance of individuals in the SLD math group. So looking at the ancillary indexes can help identify specific areas that may be driving findings seen in the primary index results. So let's look at the older adult sample first. So individuals in these samples were ages 70 years and older, and as such, they were not administered the design subtest. So the ancillary index scores for visual memory and designs could not be derived, which is why there's so many dashes in those columns. So the Alzheimer's group demonstrated lower performance than the matched control group on all available ancillary indexes. For the MCI group, the single trial learning index results indicate that the MCI group did not retain as much information after initial presentation as the matched control group, and this contrasts with the non-significant difference between the MCI and matched control group for the multi-trial learning index. Both the MCI and ages 91 to 98 years old group demonstrated lower performance on the auditory recognition memory index than matched controls. The scores for the recognition condition do not contribute to the primary index scores. So this is one instance where the ancillary index provides additional information that's not addressed at all by the primary index scores. Now let's take a closer look at the younger adult sample. So despite a lack of significant differences at the primary index level between the ASD group and matched controls for visual memory, at the ancillary index level, there are differences in visual immediate memory, visual recognition memory, and designs content and spatial. Additionally, the ASD group demonstrated lower single trial learning than matched controls, and this also contrasts with a non-significant finding for the multi-trial learning index. For the SLD math sample, results are consistent with the primary index scores. Specifically, this group demonstrated lower performance than matched controls on almost all visual memory index scores. Additionally, this group demonstrated lower performance on the single trial and multi-trial learning indexes than matched controls. The differences between scores at the subtest level also helps to understand the findings at the index level. So among the older adults, the Alzheimer's group demonstrated lower performance on all subtests than matched controls. Results from the MCI group reflected an interesting story. Although there are no differences at the index level between this group and matched controls for auditory memory, there are discrepancies. The MCI group demonstrated lower performance on the logical memory subtest than matched controls, but not lower performance, but they demonstrated equivalent performance on the verbal paired associate subtests. So it seems like the balance between those two sort of came out in the wash for the auditory memory index. So finally, lower scores on the visual working memory index were likely driven by lower performance on the symbol span subtest than matched controls. Likewise, among the 91 to 98-year-old group, lower performance on the visual working memory index was driven by lower performance on the symbol span subtest. Excuse me. For the adult group, differences at the index level between the ASD group and matched controls were driven by lower performance on both visual working memory subtests by performance on both visual working memory subtests for this group. It's also noteworthy that the differences in the design's content and spatial indexes seen on the previous slide were likely driven by performance on the immediate recall condition of the subtest. For the SLD math group, it appears that the differences in performance at the index level were driven by lower performance on the visual reproduction subtest. So these findings are generally consistent with these diagnoses and provide support for the use of the WMS-5 in clinical practice. Okay. So if all of that information wasn't enough, we have our resources page at the Pearson Assessment website for WMS-5. You can scan that QR code to go to the WMS-5 page. At that website, we have FAQs. We're going to have sample reports. We have training options for you. There's also information about the WMS-5 and pricing, including pre-publication discounts. At some point, we are going to have Chapter 1 of the Administration and Scoring Manual posted. So if you're interested in getting a preview of that, that will be available. You can also contact your assessment consultant for more information. Okay. Thank you, everyone. And I think with that, I can open it up for questions.
Hey, Jen. We've been able to keep up with a lot of the questions, but there were two that just came in here at the end related to the clinical data. So I'm going to throw these at you.
Okay.
The first is, what is the metric that is being displayed in those clinical validity tables?
Oh.
Are they Z-scores, just different scores.
Oh, okay, sorry, they are standard errors. So Cohen's D,
Standard difference. Okay.
standard difference.
Okay. And how did you differentiate on the ASD sample? And you may have to pull out your manual for this one. And a nonverbal learning disability. So between ASD and a nonverbal learning disability, how did we differentiate those in collection?
So when we collected the two main, so we actually there was autism spectrum disorder with language impairment and autism spectrum disorder without language impairment. And I don't think we necessarily screened for nonverbal learning disability.
All right. One quick question, then I will answer one of the questions that's been coming in pretty regularly. Is the official release date available for both the paper and QI releases?
So they will be available in the fall of this year.
And then just to answer, we had a lot of questions early on about the advanced clinical solutions components of the WIMS and the WACE. And just to answer that question, I don't know if the answers go out to everybody or just to the people who ask, so I'm going to just state that. The word choice or performance validity measures and the demographic adjustments to the WACE 4 and WIMS, WACE 5 and WIMS 5 scores will be available in the spring of next year. The TOPF will be available later in the year, probably in the third quarter, so August, September timeframe. And I think I will take this new question offline, but it's any final remarks on WIMS?
We're just really excited that it's going to publish, and we really hope that it contributes in a meaningful way to a better assessment of individuals, and it also greatly helps examiners. So,
And two more ACS questions came in right after that. So,
okay.
The effort measures will be released in the spring as part of that word choice and effort release. And the social cognition piece is not included in the updates. So we will turn it back over to Trish for any final comments. Thank you, Jen.
Thanks, Lisa.